Learning Spanish as a second language is an extremely confusing process, and there's lots of resources on the internet that can point you towards grammar concepts you need to know, or vocab that you need to learn, or the 30 most common verbs that you need to know and their conjugations. But I don't often see very realistic stories about how people actually learned Spanish, like the day-to-day. What was the very honest look at their progress over a given amount of time? And so in this video, I want to just try and tell the story of how I learned Spanish. It took me about 2 years, and I just want to be as dry and as realistic and honest as possible. Algo que quiero decir antes de continuar es que mis padres solo hablan inglés. Mis abuelos solo hablan inglés, y la ciudad donde crecí, casi todos que viven ahí solo hablan inglés. Y cuando yo crecí ahí, pues el inglés era el idioma principal. Y si yo puedo hacerlo, si yo puedo aprender, yo puedo alcanzar la fluidez en el español, tú también puedes hacerlo. Okay, so in the spirit of being as honest and realistic as possible, if we are being honest with ourselves, you will never be able to learn a language if you don't have some sort of intrinsic motivation to do it. For me personally, I started learning Spanish when I was 17, sort of towards the tail end of high school. And the God's honest truth is that I started learning it because I just personally had a passion for it. There has to be an initial intrinsic motivation. There has to be an initial intense curiosity, and maybe not even intense if we're being honest, but you have to have this initial curiosity. Growing up in Texas, there was Spanish around me, not particularly like in my city, but when I would go play soccer tournaments, different places, I would hear other people speaking Spanish. If we went to restaurants, we would hear people speaking Spanish. And just from a young age, I remember being so curious what they were saying, and this idea that someone else could, we're using the same mouth, it's the same biology, but they could say different things, different grammar, and it is a different language. It means different things. It just blew my mind. I had been taking Spanish classes in high school, but obviously, as everyone knows, you don't really learn you do learn vocab and intro to grammar and how to conjugate verbs and things like that in high school Spanish classes, at least in the United States, but you're not learning conversational Spanish. You're not learning Spanish in a way that can actually be applied to the real world. And I think I realized this pretty early on. So sort of combining that with this intense desire I had to learn a language, to learn Spanish, it sort of catapulted me on this path that almost inevitably I would have learned Spanish eventually. So I was debating whether or not to really talk much about this next point in this video, because the reality is that on my Spanish journey, I got incredibly lucky. Right around the time that I started to actually take Spanish more seriously and actually sat down and tried to really consume a lot more content in Spanish and try to start speaking it and asking myself, how would I say this in Spanish? There was an exchange student from Spain who came to my high school. I intentionally made friends with him so that I could practice my Spanish and also kind of give him a break throughout the day where he could use his Spanish, because basically 100% of the kids in my school only spoke English. So this is really what I mean by I got lucky, is I was already in cross country, and essentially this native speaker from Spain sort of fell in my lap, so to speak. And since he was new to the school and he didn't already have an existing friend group, it was easy for me to go up to him, introduce myself, and start getting to know him and practice my Spanish. And the result of this friendship, the result of this intentionality that I had towards meeting him and speaking Spanish with him so that I could get better, is that for about that whole school year, so it's 8 or 9 months, I was able to speak Spanish with a native Spanish speaker for 30 minutes to an hour a day for about 8 months straight. Meeting my friend from Spain and spending all this time practicing Spanish with him was such a catalyst for my motivation and curiosity to continue learning. And trust me, when you start getting better at Spanish, your your intrinsic motivation, it like increases exponentially. Because once you start feeling like you understand it even a little bit, that will carry you through to the next stages of learning. But the next major catalyst for my Spanish improvement was towards the very end of high school. I needed to get a job to make some money, and so I very intentionally, with my desire to learn Spanish in mind, chose to work at a Tex-Mex restaurant where essentially 100% of the staff was primarily Spanish speaking. So obviously working multiple shifts a week for 20, 25 hours a week around native Spanish speakers, I continued to improve. Now, admittedly, because of my experience with my friend from Spain over the previous year, I had reached a point where I could actually use Spanish in the workplace. And by the time I started working at this Tex-Mex restaurant, I was already able to form sentences and had a very admittedly limited and basic vocabulary, but I knew most of the most common words that are used. If there's one very honest piece of advice I could give if you're starting at point zero of learning Spanish, it is that you need to first establish this base set of knowledge. Just learn the 100 most common words, learn the 40 most common verbs, and how to conjugate those verbs in the present tense and the preterite past tense. This will actually carry you to a point where you can start to form sentences. Now again, in the interest of being as honest as possible, this experience working at the Tex-Mex restaurant, speaking Spanish a lot, was where I really guess I got slapped in the face with reality. Just speaking one-on-one with my friend from Spain started to get a lot easier as the months went on, but that is not every context in which you might be speaking Spanish. In the context of speaking Spanish with coworkers working in a restaurant, there's a lot of things going on during the service, and it's loud, and someone might be saying something to you very quickly. They might mumble, they might swallow the ends of their words, they might throw in a word that you don't know yet. And this is where my idea of fluency really comes into the picture. Fluency to me is not that you know every word. It's not that you know how to conjugate everything perfectly. I mean, you should know how to conjugate things more or less perfectly. It's really an ability to understand and communicate in a variety of situations. From simple situations where you're just watching someone speak Spanish in a video and maybe they're not speaking too fast, all the way to the other end of the spectrum where you're in a group of people all speaking Spanish and they're making jokes at each other, changing topics quickly. They're throwing references around to TV shows and movies, and topics just come and go super fast. You have to be able to cover this entire breadth, I would say, to really consider yourself fluent. And so at some point in your language learning journey, you have to graduate from sort of one-on-one interactions and just watching videos to being able to understand and converse effectively in these more real life scenarios. Coming off my 8-month, immersive journey speaking with my friend from Spain every day, I was feeling pretty big. I was feeling like I knew Spanish really well. And at that point, I probably would have falsely considered myself fluent. But yeah, I just really got slapped in the face when I started working at that Tex-Mex restaurant. Anyone with half a brain knows that you have to be, immersed at least a little bit to learn a language effectively, but it just cannot be overstated. Because in real life, anything can happen. Anyone can say anything to you, and there's so many more variables than there are in a classroom or in your room where things are more controlled. And when there are so many more variables, like out in the real world speaking Spanish, your brain has to adjust to that. Your brain has to get used to the fact that someone can say anything to you, and if you speak the language, hypothetically, you would be able to understand them. I really hope this video isn't seeming too rambly. I'm just trying to be as honest as possible and not speak from a script, speak from just my true experience. So yeah, after about 6 months or so of working at this Tex-Mex restaurant and being in real life scenarios, I really could hold conversations about most topics at length. And while, again, I still was not perfect all the time in my grammar, and maybe I did not understand 100% of everything that was said to me perfectly exactly like a native speaker would, I was, very, very proficient. So sort of in conclusion, the reality is you can become fluent in Spanish in 2 years, but you have to have these very motivating and immersive experiences that catapult your learning exponentially. There are programs out there for people who want to learn English from an actual native speaker. Essentially, these programs are like a language exchange where you get paired with people. And I'm not trying to advertise anything right now. I'm saying if you don't have lucky opportunities to speak Spanish with native speakers, there are programs. And if you have that intrinsic drive, that curiosity, that almost the need to learn Spanish, you will seek these things out. So again, I hope this wasn't too rambly. I just wanted to try and be as honest as possible. I hope that you were able to take something away from this video. And please subscribe, and I will be making more language-related content like this. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next video.